Before we begin today's episode, I'd like to express sincere thanks to all of our wonderful guests who shared their time and energy and wisdom with me over the last season. I'd also like to thank, importantly, all of you, our wonderful listeners spanning right across the globe. As ever, a huge thanks for all the really positive feedback which we're getting through Spotify, through Apple iTunes or YouTube channel. And I'd encourage you, if you're enjoying the podcasts, and I sincerely hope you are, why not subscribe to our ScaleX Insider 321 newsletter, where each week we provide you with 3 timeless takeaways, 2 inspirational quotes, and 1 reflection question to support your scaling psyche. Now, without further ado, Claire, you're very welcome to the ScaleX Insider podcast. How are you?
Good morning. I feel wonderful. Thanks for asking.
Good on you. The last time we met, well, of course, we've met in between, but in the context of the podcast was early November. So it's incredible now that January is behind us. So how has the start to the year been?
I honestly can't remember a January that has gone past so quickly, and I do have to keep checking myself. Is it too late to say Happy New Year to people? Because it has gone by in the blink of an eye.
Well, I don't think it's ever too late to wish people a happy, healthy, and successful 2023 scaling with purpose. So, on that note, season 7, what were your reflections from season 7?
Another fantastic season. Well done. The first thing that I want to highlight, and I think I speak on behalf of all of our listeners, is really the quality of the guests that you have on, but very specifically the great questions that you ask. And I know you conduct these like a mini masterclass so that our audience, and most of whom have aspirations to scale up, will get the very best out of it. And actually, I made a note of one of these, Brendan. It was with Adam Kingle. And how can we, as Gen X, which typically a lot of leaders are, can get the best out of Gen Y? What a great question. And they were scattered throughout the whole season. So really brilliant. Well done. It really helps as a listener for us to get the most out of the information that's being shared and the insights. I also would love to take this opportunity to wish Ryan Godfredson a big, mighty congratulations on the launch of his most recent book, The Elevated Leader. I love Ryan's work, and it was brilliant to hear him back on the podcast for a second time. Some of the reflections for me, a real learning experience whenever I listened to Chase Warrington. Again, a really good lesson on how we need to stay fresh with language, how we need to stay fresh with new terminology that's coming through with our new working arrangements. Are hyper synchronous, virtual synchronous. This is all language that I'm certainly not very familiar with, but it was a great lesson from Chase. And finally, you'll have a laugh at this, but at the weekend, whenever I was doing something really standard around the house, I was getting stuck into my massive ironing pile on a Saturday morning, and I had just finished reading the lovely little book by Mark Allen, As You Think, which was a rewrite of the original As a Man Thinketh by James Allen. And just after that, I listened to Art Markman's podcast. So As We Think talks very much about how we can direct our thought for the benefit of ourselves, and how that's essential about even how we're going out to generate success. And then Art Markman was very practical around the things that we can do really to drive behavioral change. So I did joke with you earlier saying that it was like eating beans on toast, how one really helped to absorb the other, and it was quite mind-blowing. So that was a real moment for me. So maybe some advice for anybody else listening to our podcasts, how the podcast can really be supported by reading the right materials as well. So
I
really
love
brilliant.
that. I love that. I always love your perspective. I never considered reading the 1903 classic of James Allen's As a Man Thinketh, coupled with the wonderful Art Markman's energy and wisdom from the podcast as beans on toast. But there we go, a very unique
Always a new perspective.
a very unique perspective. And thank you for your very, very kind words. I'm going to pass that on as well. We are blessed to have such a wonderful research team in Claire and Ash, and the production team, Rob, and his team at Podcast Plus. And there's a huge team, not so huge, there is a team effort goes into creating the content for our listeners. And on that note, a little appeal, I would appeal to anyone who's listening who enjoys the content. Please go on to Apple, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you listen to the podcast or watch your podcasts, and subscribe to the channel, and please leave your feedback, because this helps us really get the guests that you want to hear from. You mentioned at the outset, Claire, the quality of the guests. As the podcast continues to develop and grow, we are attracting greater guests, and actually, to come on to the podcast now, there's a 6-month waiting list, which is wonderful when I cast my mind back to the start. So thank you for those kind words. And I'll also send a congratulations also to Cameron Hurld on his 6th book, Second in Command, which was featured this season as well. It's such a wonderful book. Cameron and Ryan are only the 2 guests that have appeared on the podcast twice, given the depth and substance of their material and their wisdom for leaders who have ambition to scale. So
what an inspiration Cameron is. He mentioned about traveling to 23 countries in the last 12 months. And every so often, my husband and I have been working from home now really for about the last 3 years. And every so often I have this thought about, do you know what, we could work from anywhere. And then I remember that I've got 2 kids that go to the local school, and maybe my parents live down the road and they like to spend time with me and I like to spend time with them as well. So it's kind of quashed, but I've got to say he's truly an inspiration, and a real exemplar of how you can really optimize your life. Himself and his partner really enjoy traveling and do all of the work that he does digitally, and it's exciting.
Well, he's an exemplar of what Chase Warrington was espousing in his episode all about remote working and asynchronous versus synchronous, and we'll get into a little bit of that today. So what were some of the emerging themes from the season for you, Claire?
Excuse me. Well, a number of key messages that really struck me, and I guess I've highlighted the ones that spoke to me the most. And I'll start with the first one that really was from Ryan Godfredson, and I've written this down, but he says we need to be in a mental and emotional space to feel good when we're told we're bad. And that really got the cogs turning. And I guess for me, that is probably the best definition I have heard of self-actualization. And for those of us who remember Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the very top of the pyramid is whenever we are fully able to develop our own ability and we're fully appreciating life. That term self-actualization. And Ryan brings it into a very practical note. And if we can get our heads and our hearts in the space where we're being told that we're not good at something, but yet we still feel good about it, that was just fantastic. So that was certainly the first message that really stood out to me.
And I'll just add to that, Claire, Ryan Hawk closed the season with a focus on leading self before you lead others, before you lead the organization. And he talked about, in life, in order to attract a great partner, you have to deserve one. And I thought that was just a brilliant, profound saying in the context of scaling. In order to attract a great team, you've got to deserve one. In order to build a wonderful scaling organization, you've got to deserve one. But you can only deserve one if you've done the inner work, which is what Ryan Gottfredson is referring to in terms of the vertical development versus the horizontal development. A lot of what we speak to, people will at a cognitive level understand, but actually, are they really taking the time to vertically develop, which is what Ryan asserts in terms of gaining an understanding of yourself, your belief systems, what potentially limits you, what serves you. So that really resonates in the context of both Ryan Goffredson and Ryan Hogg.
I think as well, back to Rand Gottfredson, he defines the levels mindset 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, and he describes mindset 3.0 as getting into a contribution mindset. And specifically to get our heads into a place of the contribution mindset, we've got to have really high levels of self-awareness and self-belief and really confident with what we're doing, how we're going about doing it, so that we can actually help others to feel really good about themselves and have, again, build that level of self-belief. So it's just, I suppose, on a very practical note, it's a situation, because we all get feedback where we kind of bristle inside, or we get defensive, or we get scared. But actually, to take that feedback, knowing that we've got that high level of self-belief within ourselves and we understand ourselves very well, and actually take that and feel good about it, is that it's top of the triangle. It's top of the
Yeah,
pyramid.
and just for those listeners who haven't heard the episode, what we're referring to there in Mind 1, Mind 2, and Mind 3.0, ultimately where we want to reach to scale with purpose is Mind 3. Now, the reality is we'll oscillate typically between a number of those, between 1, 2, and 3 at different points in any given week, in any given month, in any given quarter, in our careers. But we want to exist at a Mind 3 level, that contribution mode. Mind 1 being standing in, you don't want to be seen or heard. Mind 2 is very much standing out. You want to be seen and heard as a leader. Mind 3 is an understanding, a deep understanding of both, but ultimately with the aim of contributing to something greater. And this is the essence of scaling with purpose.
Mhm. So that was the first message. That was brilliant. The second message that really got me thinking was from Cameron Herald. And he talked about whenever you're growing really fast, and you need to hire people who know what they're doing. So it was that whole debate over skills versus cultural fit. And I guess where I landed after throwing that around in my head for a little while was I'm kind of in two minds, because we can never look past. It's very tempting to go out and get a person who's doing it and bring them into our organization because they'll hit the ground faster. But we can never look past developing our people from within. And I guess the point that really reinforced to me was we've got to start early, and we've got to start developing people within and the right things, so that when the requirement comes up within the scaling organization, that person can step into the role and hit the ground running. Because again, Cameron referred to, he talked about the leader. We often refer to the builders. We went out to look for the builders as opposed to the people who could come in when things were built and run it. And that's probably the role that Cameron referred to, this the kind of post 100 million revenue mark. But we were always building. But the people who are growing within have a really good understanding of our DNA, and they know how we operate and they know how we tick. So yeah, I guess I threw that one around in my head a little bit. There are times whenever we need to bring those skill levels into the organization, because sometimes that raises the overall bar for everybody. And actually, it's a great learning experience in itself, bringing somebody in with all that wisdom that they've gained somewhere else, but not at the expense of developing our own people within and giving them the skills and equipping them with what they need to take those opportunities on whenever they arise. So, again, another great key message that spoke to me.
Yeah, brilliant. And I love that. And, that's quite a unique skill set. That person, that second in command, who is inspired to get involved in helping you build a scaling organization who can empathize with those on the factory floor and resonate, have their message resonate with those on the factory floor and inspire those who sit around the boardroom table, and everything in between. It's quite a unique skill set, and we often found, certainly in our scaling experience, that, and we mentioned this in the podcast episode, you were flattered by those who worked in the large corporates, who were interested in your company. You inspired them to join and realize that actually it was oil and water, that this simply didn't, their skill set didn't mix with what we needed at a point in time. So
He
it's
gave the
being
example
careful.
of some. Sorry, he gave the example of somebody joining him and saying, was it something like who fills out my
The
forms?
FedEx form.
FedEx
Yeah,
form.
it's you.
And that's often where the difference lies. It's people growing within SMEs. You got to turn your hand to everything and just do things to make it work and keep nudging it forward. Whereas in larger organizations, and again, I can't overlook. Cameron told a really impactful story at the end of his interview, and I was really inspired by his honesty when he talked about sitting down with the leader of the organization, with the CEO, whenever the company went beyond the 100 million revenue, and he talked about how they had a conversation that Cameron's skills didn't fit that organization anymore. And that is incredible bravery. And it took me back to an ex manager of mine, and she had that same bravery. And she said, my skills fit for this business where it is right now. And I often thought that's a very mature outlook, because, yes, there were tears, as Cameron described, but there was no defensiveness, no fear for hanging on to something that actually you'd outgrown it, or it had outgrown you. So it's that getting maybe used to that transient nature, uh, but doing it in a respectful manner.
Absolutely. What were some of the other emerging themes for you, Claire?
Well, whilst we're on Cameron, I've got to say I'm a massive fan. He gave great advice. He talked about how a CEO, the core components of a great relationship between a CEO and a COO. And again, it got me thinking about the role of chief people officer, which I played, and the CEO, and it's largely overlapping. And I would say even further, it applies to great partners. There was three things, I've noted them down here. One of them is help to bring each other back to reality, because again, he described the CEO, typically the visionary, and the COO was more practical, perhaps. But even a partnership, bringing people into reality. Sometimes you got the optimist, sometimes you got a pessimist, and sometimes you change roles. But taking those opportunities to kind of give each other that check and balance is the first thing. Number two was decompress together, step away, take time out and have a bit of fun. And that's whenever you get to know each other really well as well. And then the third thing, every great partner should be not responsible is not the word I want, but should be removing obstacles for each other and clearing the path and the way forward. So great advice from Cameron. And I say that, for anybody out there who's a co-founder, who's got that relationship with the CEO, it's just those are three great fundamental rules to live by.
Completely agree. And we take that back to Ryan Godfreyson's work as well, in terms of the vertical development. When you understand that ultimately you want to arrive at this mind three position, where it's about contribution, about serving an organizational vision, where many partnerships fail, I feel, is, the ego ultimately gets in the way, where if one feels someone else is getting more limelight, or, doing some of the things that they would like to be doing, or, and the honesty isn't had in relation to what needs to be discussed, then ultimately those relationships invariably implode. You need that raw honesty, and to arrive at that, you need to understand yourself. What is it that really energizes you? What do you love doing? what inspires you, and what is your unique ability, your talent? What are you bringing to the organizational vision? And you've got to do that work. And ultimately, great partnerships work whenever there's and he has it in the front cover of his book, the yin and yang relationship. And I have to say, I feel we really have that. We were discussing off air, but in our own business now, Simple Scaling, you're doing the things you absolutely love. I'm doing the things that I absolutely love, but I wouldn't want to be doing the things that you're doing.
No, I'm really with you. I'm very grateful for that as well. But yeah, feel very blessed. We were actually talking about that kind of cold winter's morning where we used to have that conversation in a car park, and it's just really naturally fallen into place. But that's being aware of your strengths and actually
Absolutely.
continuing that open communication about what you enjoy, and back to that feedback. Coming at it compassionately. We give each other feedback regularly, and you know put it into action, but use it, but know that it's well intended, and the
Yeah.
person's actually doing it to make you better. And actually, that's a lovely segue into my final message I wanted to share with you. Adam Kingle, loved that podcast. I love that awareness that he gave our listeners about the different generations and different expectations of newer generations. But, and again, I've noted this, he said, people will be much more responsive to a poor performance review or tough feedback if they can understand how their performance is holding them back from achieving their personal goals as opposed to the company goals. And yeah, creating that line of sight and actually knowing that this is making me better. If I take this feedback on board and I can prevent myself from getting defensive or fearful or scared or cross, all those different emotions that we know all bubble to the surface when we're given that type of feedback. And we know that the person is intending to make us better as individuals and more successful in our careers. It's much better well received, but it only comes when you take the time to map out that thread, that link between the company goals and somebody's personal goals. So really powerful. Love that.
Yeah, I love that. And he used the term the golden thread between personal goals and organizational goals. And when you take the time as a leader to understand the person who is in your team, who is bringing their talent to the table to support the scaling ambition, when how many times, I suspect, if people are listening, have you been asked about your personal goals? What are you trying to achieve, in the next 6 months, the next 12 months, in the next 3 years, in the next 5 years? And how can the attainment, the progress towards our organizational vision support you in the attainment of your own personal vision, your own goals that are aligned to your own personal vision? How powerful will that be?
It's the same as, back to Kevin Schulman's podcast. I can't recall what season it was, but Kevin Schulman, that's where I got the inspiration around setting my personal vision. And once you've got that vision, uh, it's hard to set personal goals without kind of knowing where they're taking you to. And in the same way that leaders find it quite challenging to get themselves out in front and start to imagine what that looks like on a very personal level, that's quite challenging as well. So, but once you've got that personal vision, then breaking it down into those goals is great. But actually having somebody within your business as a leader who's prompting you, who's asking you about that, and who's linking those goals to the company goals is really quite exceptional. So great message.
Love those, Claire. Were there any messages coming through that really captured your curiosity? Was there anything you were hearing for the first time?
Plenty. Uh, Chase Warrington, I have to say, was all of that was really first time for me. I hadn't really accepted the fact. Yes, I was very well aware that we are evolving in terms of our working styles, and certainly the language around remote first was familiar with me, but that was a real lesson around the hyper asynchronous, virtual synchronous. And I'll be very honest. I love the fact that they have been brave enough and do it to define that culture, because cultures should differentiate. But I made the decision when I was listening to that, that's not a culture that I would buy into. And I know I say this with the best will in the world, 'cause I know Chase was saying that they prioritize people first. But I know me pretty well, and I know I get my charge of interacting with people a lot. And and I can totally understand how that type of a working environment would really appeal to newer generations who are more technology focused. Maybe I'm just old school, but it's I suppose it's important that when a company differentiates their culture in the same way that theirs had done, sorry, Doist have done. um, I think it allows for people to make the decision whether I want to be part of that, that would get the best out of me, or otherwise. So that was that was really insightful. That episode was really insightful for me.
You've answered a question that I was going to ask, because I was thinking as I was recording that with Chase, what is Claire going to think about this, given that you're a fearless champion and lover of people, and I know you really get energized from in-person interaction. So that was an interesting insight. It's just recognizing that this type of culture is very deliberate, it's very well defined, it's very intentional. What I would say, and I challenge Chase on this, they have a culture, he says, which is agnostic in terms of where they're actually performing the work, but they still actually devote time to actually coming together. So he talked about what we would term our strategic pit stops, that time away, that they're very deliberate about, where they'll take a week away, they'll bring the entire team, over 100 people. And he said, we're not really focused on the work. It's all about developing the relationships during that time. So he did acknowledge and recognize the importance of that. It's just not done in the conventional or traditional sense as we know it.
And bottom line is, our business, so Simple Scaling, is a remote first business.
Yeah.
And we work in that. It's just whenever you go hyper asynchronous, you're just turning up the volume on that. And that's the bit that makes me slightly uneasy. So remote first, it's, yeah, but it's just, it's there are organizations out there that have extreme cultures. And actually, I'm very respectful of the fact that they've taken the time to define it. And they, in the essence of your vibe attracts your tribe, you've got to do that to get the right people into the organization that you're going to be able to retain. So I'm very respectful of that.
Anything else that captured your curiosity during the season?
Yes. One thing in particular, and I think I heard it in every single episode, and it was around time and how we spend it. And if I think back to Bob Moesta, I loved it. He said, time is the greatest paradox. It's free and it's priceless at the same time. Um, and I guess every single episode got me thinking. And, whenever I heard Jack Daly talk about the 168 hours in the week, and Bob was also talking about death date. And there's no doubt that we need to be deliberate in how we spend our time. I guess again, I went away and thought that through, as I do, and I concluded that there's actually probably a lot more skill required with managing that balance of being deliberate with our time. And then back to the Ryan Hawk statement at the end around our ability to build deep connections with people. It's actually a real driver of happiness and joy. And to some extent, there's tension there. And that's what I'm saying. It requires more skill. Whenever we're deliberate with time and we're very focused, I've got an hour here, I've got to get this done. Sometimes it makes people not feel safe and not open up. And then when people don't feel safe and open up, you miss the little golden nuggets that are important to people and that actually will make people feel important and people feel special, and those things. So if you're very rigid with your time, so all I'm saying is there's a balance there, but it's got to be managed with skill.
I love that, Claire. Are you a proponent of the death date?
It scares the life out of me. No, I will not be working out my death date.
Just on Jack, what a force of nature. You know,
Brilliant.
I so enjoyed Jack. You know, what an inspiration in his 70s. You know, in his head, he's just approaching midlife. Just such a
Right.
wonderful, wonderful attitude. You know, he embarrassed a lot of the male listeners when he disclosed that he leaves little love notes for his partner, for his wife, whenever he's leaving town, so that she can find them while he's away. And what an inspirational guy. What did you take from Jack?
Yeah, there was one there was one message, and again, it struck me. It struck a chord, and it said, if you're is it doing the work of an assistant, you are one. Uh, and that really got me thinking as well, you know. And actually, I'll save that for my big takeaway, or what I'm going to do differently this time for the end, because it
Right.
actually tied back in with an exercise that Cameron Herald highlighted in his podcast. So that whole concept of time and how we treat our time and how we're deliberate with time, but then coupled with back to the Margaret Heffernan, the importance of building the social capital and Ryan Hawke's messages, I found sometimes it was conflicting, and it just requires that little bit of thought. But where I landed was both are important, but there's a fine balance, and we need to manage it quite carefully.
Well, that is a timely segue into that question. What are you going to do differently as a result?
So I thought about this, as I always do whenever I go into every season. I'm looking for the thing that I feel that would make the most difference. And I have to start by saying, over Christmas this year, as most people are whenever they're going into a new year, you become quite reflective. And I recall back to a conversation that I was having in December 2021. So last Christmas, and I was called out on this by a friend, and I was focusing very much on what I hadn't done yet. And I was just bypassing everything that I had done. And I think over the last 12 months, again, through the podcast, I've taken a lot of the advice around, I've defined my personal purpose, I've defined my vision. I have spent the last 12 months doing gratitudes, which I have found incredible. I do my deep breathing, I do my cold water swimming every Sunday morning, still, even through
Well
winter.
done, you.
And I found that my conversations at Christmas time were very different. And when people were saying to me, how are things going within the business? Brilliant. And I had a noticeable shift in my mindset. And I actually put that down to a lot of the tools that I'm starting to experiment with. So one of the things I would recommend to all of our listeners is take something away, make it practical, and put it into action. So you'll recall from the last one, what I put into action was I was going to attempt journaling, and it was Jim Lear had inspired me to do that the last time. And I went into that just before Christmas with my daughter, who's 12, and she gave up pretty quickly. And I'm still doing it. And I have to say, I didn't find it that easy to get started, because, again, being quite a reflective person, it tends to come to me, those moments tend to come to me if I'm maybe driving or if I'm going for a walk. Sitting down every morning and being reflective I find quite hard. And also, whenever you're thinking about your gratitudes, you need to get it quite granular. And so it took me a little bit of time to get into the swing of things. Now, I've probably been doing it for 2, maybe almost 3 months. So I'm probably at the point where I'm going to take my little journal now and go back and see if I can identify those trends, which was going to help me learn a little bit more about myself. But I haven't done that yet. But one of the things I am conscious of, and I see coming up in my journal regularly, is the fact that I am very busy. And that's probably why those messages were coming through loud and clear with me about how I'm spending my time. So Cameron made the point of, and again, one thing that we work with all of our business leaders who are running scaling businesses, whenever they are, to let go and to make sure that you're staying at that 30,000 feet in the air level and having a good overall grasp of the organization. So this time, my commitment, what I'm going to do differently, I'm going to list down everything I do, all my tasks in one column. I am then going to evaluate my competence level. Maybe you could help me with that in the second column. And then I'm going to maybe not do the hourly rate, but then I'm going to look at the things that I don't really need to be doing and I can potentially pass over to others so that I can let go and maintain that level. So that's my commitment before the next one.
I love that, and I would encourage people listening, if you haven't already completed this task, what Cameron was referring to was taking an activity inventory, and I remember the acronym because it's ICE, and to list the things that you're incompetent at doing, the things that you're, list all the things out that you do on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, everything from you waking up in the morning to you go to bed at night, all the little tasks, whether it's answering emails, sending out letters, packaging books, whatever it is, all of those little things that you think, well, they're menial, I don't need to capture that, and capture it all. And he mentioned the things you're incompetent at, the things you're competent at, the things you're excellent at, and the things that play to your unique ability. Now, what I would say is actually I would go a step further and make that a little bit easier, and I've encouraged people to do this in the past. It's just, your ABC inventory. Your A's are those things that play to your absolute unique ability, you absolutely love doing. And your day really, ultimately the Holy Grail is to fill your day with those things that you love doing and are really delivering value aligned to your scaling ambition. B is the things that you're good at, but you don't really love. You just do them because they're a function of the job. And C are the things that you absolutely despise doing, but you haven't delegated to anyone else, and you feel it's unfair to delegate to anyone else. Now, what I would say in those C tasks, the things that you do not like doing, let's take the example even of completing your own tax return. Well, kind of, it's my tax return, I've got to do it. There is a world of accountants out there who absolutely love doing tax returns and make a living from it. And in all of these things, those things that fall into the C category that you hate, when you compile those, ultimately you will create a job for someone else to play to their unique ability, which will create capacity and space for you to continue to develop and grow aligned to your own unique ability, which will ultimately serve the vision. And what we find with so many business leaders, we coin the term dead man walking, those people who get caught, those leaders who get stuck in the bowels of the business, trapped in the bowels of the business because they feel compelled to do everything. And when you stand back, just really step back and assess and be forensic with that assessment about those tasks that you do on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. What are the other jobs what are the tasks that you can delegate away, which will ultimately free you up to do more of the things that you love, which ultimately then it's self-fulfilling, which will create more energy, which will ultimately lead to you feeling more inspired. It's all of those things. So
it's a really interesting point, because I think many people, probably like myself, are programmed where you're almost too compassionate of those around you. And I was given great advice, and I actually find myself doing this on a very practical level. I know they're so busy, so I can't hand that to them. But I remember being given great advice somewhere along the line saying, you shouldn't be making that decision on their behalf. Let them make that decision, whether they're too busy to do the tasks that you think that they're too busy to do. So it's not your decision to make. So you delegate and you hand that over, and if they're too busy, they'll tell you.
Absolutely. And another great line, and I can't recall who said it during the season: don't kill somebody else's potential because you're locked in your own comfort zone. This is the other side of this, where actually you don't want to take on anything else because you you've reached this place of comfort,
Yeah.
and ultimately you're preventing someone else from actually growing. So love that, Claire. Look, given the entire season, what were your 3 favorite takeaways?
So I've gone a little bit off course this time, so I haven't picked up the timeless takeaways that the folks had given in their podcast, but I picked out my favorite takeaways from all of their podcasts. So my first one was with Bob Moesta, and he said the line, "I already know, I don't know." And I think that's just an incredible and really healthy way to look at the world, in wonder and curiosity. So it's a lovely mantra and potentially an affirmation to have. I already know, I don't know. And it just sets you up with a really nice frame of mind. So that's the first. Second one was Art Markman. And this one was one of his takeaways. He said, "Be open. The world is way more interesting than our imagination is." And I love that as well. Big favorite of mine. And then my final one, I love Paul Rolkin's podcast. Really got me thinking as well around, he focused quite a lot of time spent talking about what we shouldn't do and how that's just as important what we should do. And one of the things, certainly that we would see working with leaders of scaling businesses is, startups, you saying yes to everything. But as you graduate into scale up, you then start to become a little bit braver and more confident in what you're doing. And, all of a sudden you don't want to work with that customer because they don't work very well with you. They don't make you feel good, or something dilutes your proposition. So you're kind of saying no a little bit more, which I love, that level of confidence, and allows you to kind of refine that. But he talked about logic makes people think and emotion makes people act. And I just loved that. And that was a big takeaway for me as well. So those are my 3 faves.
Absolutely love those. Really, really love those. Claire, before we close, anything else that you would like to leave our listeners with as a result of listening to season 7?
I guess one thing, just really, it's, as businesses grow, and I guess as our businesses are scaling, sometimes it can be really easy to get stuck in what we're doing and thinking this is working, and not really appreciate the change. And it was one thing that Adam Kingle said, and one thing that I would speak to a lot of people about, by 2025, 75% of our workforce are going to be made up of a newer generation, Gen Y or millennials. And I'm not a big fan of labeling people, but they undoubtedly bring a new way of thinking around technology, around how they like to work, that constant feedback that Adam talked about in personal development. And if we want to attract those people into our scaling businesses and retain them, we need to start to think slightly differently. And I think that came through really loud and clear. And I really just want to say thanks to Adam for reinforcing that message, to help us to understand why we need to check in and change things sometimes.
Brilliant. Well, on that note of gratitude, I would like to thank you for your wonderful insight, your depth of perspective. I always enjoy these wrap up conversations, and I look forward to season 8's wrap up when we come together again in May. In the meantime,
Me
take
too.
care.
Thank you so much. Cheerio.